Hello, everyone. While we're all heading into the presentation, let me review a few housekeeping items with you. First and foremost, I know you're going to have a lot of really great questions, and we look forward to hearing them. So please ask those questions in the Q&A box as we go, and we will stop at the end and answer your questions. So again, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, two little bubbles. Please put your questions there as we go. And then you'll see on the bottom right of your screen, more with 3 dots. If you click that, you can put some closed captions on. And if that's helpful for you, we welcome you to do that. You might also see 2 little CCs at the bottom of your screen that say show captions. So thank you for being with us. My name is Katie Sorrentino. I am the Director of Wellness Initiatives here at Friends Life Care. And I'm very excited about the speaker we have today. I also want to thank one of our members, who I know is here, who read an article from our speaker and sent it to me and said, we need to get this person to come to talk to us. So I'm very grateful that he made the time. Our speaker today is Dr. Jason Karlawish, a physician and writer. There's nothing he doesn't do from his bio. He researches and writes about issues at the intersections of bioethics, aging, and the neurosciences. He's the author of a number of interesting books: The Problem of Alzheimer's, How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis and What We Can Do About It, and the novel Open Wound, The Tragic Obsession of Dr. William Beaumont. His essays have been published in Forbes, The Hill, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and more. And he is a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania, and the co-director of the Penn Memory Center, where he cares for patients. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Karlawish. Thank you so much for being with us to talk about supportive decision-making.
Well, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. Greetings. I'm Jason Karlawish, and I'm talking to you from Penn's campus. In fact, I'm in the Van Pelt Library. You may be wondering why I'm in Van Pelt Library and not in my office. And the answer is because I don't have an office. Our office at Ralston House has been closed because they discovered some structural and related issues that require a complete kind of interior renovation, etc. So they asked us all to vacate our offices. Hence, I am truly among the diaspora searching for an office. So after this call is done, I'll be meeting some of my colleagues for our lab meeting in a conference room here in Van Pelt. Hence, that's why I'm in Van Pelt Library. I guess one of the shining or copper linings of the pandemic is that we're all used to doing these various meetings and things remotely and stuff. So it's a pleasure to be here. I was thrilled to have this opportunity to talk to you today. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself first, and then what I thought I'd do is pivot to the specific topic that you asked me to speak on, which is this idea of supported decision-making. I have a hunch that that conversation or that presentation will engender a series of questions that kind of emanate out from it around why someone would need supported decision-making and some discussions of those particular reasons why they need supported decision-making. The venue we have here is this type-in Q&A method, and there are already 2 questions in the chat, in the question and answer, which I'll get to as we go. And so you have to be mindful that I don't have that kind of luxury of normal human communication where I can see people and you can ask me a question. So it'll be a little stilted, but we'll get through this. So just a bit more about me. And again, I'm working off a laptop, so I have this very tiny screen ability. I just want to share one thing about me, which was mentioned, and I think given the fact that you wanted me to speak on this, this is a bit about, I am a writer, and this is a book I wrote, came out about 2 years ago called The Problem of Alzheimer's, How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis and What We Can Do About It. It's available in hardback and audiobook and also paperback. The paperback actually has some updated chapters and so therefore has additional content. So I think you may find, if you do choose to read it, get the paperback, to be blunt. So that's that. I wrote that, and I think it will be very relevant to you in the audience, given your interest in supported decision making, because it sort of gets at one of the problems that leads people to need supported decision making, not to play too much on the idea of problem, but I did. So I'm a physician, I'm a geriatrician. I take care of patients at the Penn Memory Center, which is here at the University of Pennsylvania in the Perelman School of Medicine. The Penn Memory Center is a center dedicated to research and care for persons living with diseases that cause dementia, such as Alzheimer's, Lewy body disease, frontotemporal lobar degeneration, for example. And I help run a research program called the Penn Program on Precision Medicine for the Brain, which examines the biomarker transformation of diseases like Alzheimer's, with attention to the opportunities and the challenges when those diseases, biomarkers are translated into clinical practice, into the diagnosis and treatment of patients. And indeed, the topic we're talking about emanates from that topic area of the biomarker transformation. Supported decision making. I give you a little bit of history, which is I'm a member of the American Bar Association's Commission on Law and Aging. And it was through that work a couple of years ago that I discovered there's this concept called supported decision making. And it was presented to me in the context of the lives of persons with developmental disabilities. So in developmental disabilities or developmental disorders, an individual's born, and as they chronologically age, family parents begin to notice that the child is not meeting developmental milestones, particularly cognitive developmental milestones. And ultimately, oftentimes there's a cause found for that, Down syndrome, any number of other typically brain diseases that are the cause. And the family gets together and puts together a plan of care for that individual. And in many cases, the story of that person's life will ultimately be a story of triumph in the face of the adversities of a developmental disorder. Many of you may know individuals who either raised or themselves had, say, Down syndrome, and thrived as a child into adolescence. What many families encountered and many individuals with Down syndrome encountered was a challenge. And the challenge was that after the age of 18, or upon reaching the age of 18, of course, an individual is an adult. And in the eyes of the law, being an adult means you're in charge of your life. You can make contracts and break contracts. You can vote. You can own a house. You can get married, although I think marital ages in some states are lower. And there's a host of sort of roles of an adult that suddenly become assigned to you because you are now an adult and also responsible for what you do. You can be held to blame greater than you would be if you had done the same thing a few years younger. Again, I recognize that the law has shifted the age of certain things up and down. For example, you can't drink alcohol until you're 21. And we could spend a lot of time on sort of why that age and not that age. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But what I want to spend some time on is the challenge that many individuals with developmental disabilities suddenly faced, which is now they're on their own, so to speak. And yet, of course, it's understood just because the day that they turned 18 meant they're on their own didn't mean that suddenly they had acquired additional decisional abilities, cognitive skills, such that they could live, quote, on their own, whatever on their own means, by the way. And many families would recognize that. And they'd say, well, he needs a lot of help doing financial matters. He needs a lot of help negotiating life's complexities. Indeed, there are some complexities that I really don't think he should be negotiating because of the risk of fraud or making costly errors, et cetera. And so what families would do is they'd say, well, let's just get a guardianship. And a guardianship was the solution to the problem. It was a blunt solution, though, and is a blunt solution. Guardianship essentially means I am now in charge of you. I am you. You are no longer a legal person. You have been, in the eyes of the law, depersoned. If anything needs to be decided by you, I decide. And if you decide, that's fine, but no one has to listen to you. You cannot execute a contract. You cannot have a bank account. And you could run through the long list of things. And you can understand why a family would do this, because it sort of solved a big problem, which is, well, we'll just keep on taking over things. Of course, we'll let them do things and whatnot, but this solves a lot of concerns and worries, as well as addresses daily present problems. Um, well, the clock goes to sometime in the 90s, early aughts. An individual with Down syndrome said, I don't want that. I want to make my own decisions. I can. I have a job, etc. Long story short, they sued their parents and said, you can't be my guardians. And the outcome of that lawsuit was to rule in favor of the individual with Down syndrome and say that she was able to make decisions, that a guardianship was an overly blunt instrument, so stripping her of her personhood, of her identity, of her status as an adult. And the remedy that the court came up with was this idea of what was known as supported decision making. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the general point that I want to make now is not to condemn guardianship wholesale and completely. There's obviously a role for an adult to be under guardianship. We can imagine an individual with profound impairments in their cognitive abilities as a result of a disease or injury, for whom the idea that they could make a decision is just a fiction, and someone really needs to step in and help and make decisions for them. And I certainly have been part of efforts to get a guardianship for patients of mine who, as a result of a neurodegenerative disease, simply lack the ability to make key decisions. And in fact, the decisions they are making are causing them harms. They're being defrauded of money, et cetera. And so, I have filled out the necessary paperwork for the law, the courts to step in and decide whether, in fact, a guardianship is needed. And I'm very mindful when I do this that I've essentially taken away someone's ability to be recognized as a legal person. Unfortunately, though, guardianships for adults are abused. They are often handed out on a very summary basis for individuals simply because they have a diagnosis. There is, sadly, was and still remains in America a record of guardianships being awarded on the basis of cursory exams of the individual, cursory court hearings, and guardianship status being given to someone who actually is what's known as a, quote, professional guardian. There are some scandalous stories that have accumulated of individuals who are guardians for multiple people, now controlling all of their property and clearly using and abusing that property. I believe there's a TV series, I forget the name, which is all about just this. Someone in, I think, Las Vegas who's a sort of professional guardian. If someone knows what that TV series is, by all means, put it in the Q&A so folks can go watch it. But again, do not take from my talk a condemnation of guardianship. Instead, I'd like you to recognize that it's a blunt tool. It's a very powerful tool. It's, like many tools, needs to be deployed carefully and judiciously. A knife can cut steak or do a number of other wonderful things. A knife can also kill. We could keep that metaphor going with any number of tools. In my book, by the way, I have a whole chapter on this issue. So back to that case, the remedy was supported decision making. And now I sort of owe you a description of what I mean by supported decision making. Supported decision making is a legal mechanism wherein an individual designates someone else to support them in making decisions, to assist them where they have difficulties in cognition, information processing, and allow them, though, ultimately to make the decision. So supported decision making recognizes the role of another person in the life of someone to assist them, but also recognizes that the decision is that of the individual. The advantages for decision making are many, and I'll go through that. Many states in the union now recognize supported decision making as a legitimate mechanism between the extremes of you're on your own, figure it out, or we're going to put you under a guardianship and strip away your rights. And it occupies this important middle space. So everything I've been talking about so far has been the history of individuals with developmental disabilities. And let's think a little bit more about developmental disabilities. So by the time an individual reaches about the age of 18, 19, 20, certainly through their 20s, brain development largely ceases. And that individual now is making decisions with their full capacities, whatever they may be. And those capacities are relatively static for much of the life course. And so supported decision-making has this kind of static quality, which is you are who you are, the way you are, I figure you out, we work together, we make decisions. And you can understand why it's a very attractive model as opposed to guardianship for someone who has a cognitive disability. By the way, I believe you can't see me. So I'm going to, whoops, close that window, stop sharing, and I hope you can see me now.
Yes, we can see you.
Have you been seeing me all along?
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, well, I took down the ad for my book. Um, so let's think about another use case, if you will, for supported decision-making. And that's not the individual who grew up, developed into their peak cognitive abilities, but still has some troubles, but rather an individual who grew up into their peak cognitive abilities, did quite well in life, carried on into graduate education, carried on into a job, perhaps raised a family, etc. But then in their later years, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, things started to change. Troubles remembering new information, asking a question, getting the answer, and then asking it again 30 minutes later. When new information was presented, finding it overwhelming and complex and just kind of jumping to the first thing and saying, well, that's what I'll do, to sort of avoid the complexities of the decision, face them. When presented opportunity to do something that has some benefits, but also some risks, kind of only seeing the benefits and kind of failing to recognize the risks and making an impulsive decision. In other words, what I'm running through is all the various ways that a brain, because of a variety of different diseases, can begin to have cognitive impairments, and those cognitive impairments translate into difficulties making day-to-day decisions, living day-to-day life. In some sense, I've walked you up to a sort of description of what it is like to be a person living with the early signs and symptoms of a disease like Alzheimer's disease. I recognize the stereotype of a disease like Alzheimer's disease as someone who perhaps has profound disabilities in self-care, putting on clothing, bathing, etc. And no doubt, over time, for some individuals, those problems may develop. But for much of the course of being a person living with a disease like Alzheimer's, the problems are in things like organizing the paperwork and related financial matters, putting together a grocery list, getting the groceries, and then bringing them home and making the meal, being presented the opportunities for adjustments to a financial portfolio and deciding what those decisions should be, going to a hospital and being presented complicated information about a promising new therapy for Alzheimer's disease called lecanemab, which has a host of upsides and downsides that need to be thought through. In other words, we can go through a whole list of decisions in life that for a person living with Alzheimer's disease become challenging. We could say the same story for an individual living with late limbic-associated TTP encephalopathy, or normal pressure hydrocephalus, or Lewy body disease, or vascular dementia, or some combination of all of these diseases. My point is that the early problems, and for many years, the dominant problems in an individual with these diseases is difficulties doing life's daily activities, many of which are very much contingent upon making decisions. If you think about it, a lot of the activities of life are ultimately about making a decision. You know, what do I want to buy at the store? What don't I want to buy, etc. How do I want to pay for this bill, etc. Well, enter supported decision making. So you have this interesting sort of world of the law, which is a person is either fully capable of determining their life, or the person's not capable and needs a guardian. That's what the law's sort of perspective is. But for the life of an individual with Alzheimer's disease, there is this vast middle area. I was going to say gray area, but I reject it. It's a vast, just middle area in between having the abilities the person had that got them to where they were in life versus a period of time where they clearly need someone else to take things over and take care of them. And in between is this liminal space. And that's where supported decision-making fits. So supported decision-making becomes a way to acknowledge and recognize the role of another individual to help someone who has a disease like Lewy body disease or Alzheimer's disease or late, LATE is the name of that disease, to make a decision. And to recognize still, though, that the individual with the disease is the decision maker. Now, I know that many of you are hearing this and you're going, this is the most long-winded description I have ever heard of a caregiver. And this is the most uninteresting re-saying putting old wine in a new bottle and claiming you've got a new vintage. And I would disagree. It is a recognition in some sense of the role of a caregiver. But if you think about it, caregivers are not stereotypically thought of as people who assist with decision making. Caregivers are often kind of reduced to this sort of high-powered, supercharged, underpaid, overworked maid, butler, life coach, whatever. And we don't really recognize that one of the chief roles of a caregiver early on in the course of the disease is decision making, helping someone else make a decision. Moreover, we don't really train caregivers to do this. If you look at caregiver training, you see bits of it. You do, but it's not framed as you are supporting this person making a decision. It's framed as how to address and take on the various roles of caregiving, et cetera. What are some of the challenges? What are the resources you need? I'm not being critical of the existing models of caregiver training. I'm just saying they sort of elide around what is a plain, hidden in plain sight fact, which is to be a caregiver is to be a person in the role of helping someone else make decisions. It's not the only role, but it is central to the role. And indeed, you could argue some caregivers who you know, and you yourself may be one, will sort of say, you know what? That is what I do, and I'm really bad at it, actually. I just kind of bully the person along. I just kind of take care of it, et cetera. And I'm not being critical of you. I'm just saying that until you sort of call something out for what it is, do you finally know, well, when is it, and when is it not it, and when is it being done well, and when is it being done poorly, such that you'd say, wow, you're really not very good at that. You're right. Or, wow, you are really good at that. I was a poet all along and I never even know it. So we, my colleagues and I, have introduced into the care of older adults, people living with neurodegenerative diseases, the idea that supported decision-making is a model that should be embraced for how to think about the care of these individuals. It's not the only thing that they need, but it foregrounds the role of what a caregiver does. Moreover, it points out that all the more reason why some people say, well, I don't have just one caregiver, I have three, which respects the fact that some people are good at one thing and not the other. He's in charge of the driving and the doing. I'm in charge of the sort of thinking and deciding. And many families will describe to me setups that essentially are this sort of diversified portfolio of different individuals. Moreover, once you call out and recognize someone in the role of supported decision making, I think what you've done is given a social status to them, which is very important. It's the reason why when they show up to the hospital, we need to go talk to that person. We need to make sure they have a space in the hospital room so that they can be there and not like be shoved in a corner in an uncomfortable chair all day, or going to the outpatient doctor's office, why they need to be in the room, or to the bank, or to the financial advising firm. So you can run through a whole list of professionals who work with older adults, for whom recognizing that there is this other individual who is in this role needs to be acknowledged so that you can properly deliver your professional services. I think this is particularly important in fields like the financial field, where emphasis on privacy, et cetera, are supreme, and they ought to be supreme. But they ought to also recognize that the person may need someone else there to help them make decisions. And the standard response in the financial services industry is often, well, until you have power of attorney, we're not going to talk to you. Well, remember, the problem with power of attorney is it's power to steal. If I give you power of attorney, you can walk into the bank and say, I'm here to take out some money from Jason Karlawish's account, and they have no reason to stop you any more than they can stop Jason Karlawish, because you have power of attorney. Power of attorney was designed for people who are going away on long sea journeys, so that while they were away, my dear friend Silas McCumber can manage my affairs until I return from my voyage to Europe. You shall see me in 9 months. I mean, that was the model for what a power of attorney was. And it's certainly a robust model still today for individuals, but it has its problems, and namely subject to abuse. So let me situate this in the arc of history a bit more. Once upon a time, but not that long ago, in fact, I think for many people on this call, this conference, the notion that a doctor would ask a patient for a decision about their care was contested. The idea of getting informed consent was one that was viewed by many physicians as not medical practice. Doctors would decide what the patient needs. I'm not saying they wouldn't talk to the patient. I'm not saying that they wouldn't even ask the patient, what do you want? But doctors proceeded with an ethic that says the decision that we made will really be my decision. When informed consent was introduced in the 20th century, many physicians openly and vocally opposed it as a model for the practice of medicine. They said that it was incompatible with the practice of medicine. Some of my staff are showing up for the lab meeting. It'll be in the library in a few minutes, by the way. That's what I'm waving to. And they opposed it. And they would write essays and letters to the editor of medical journals saying, I'm not going to give into this legal fiction. Well, that was the 1950s, 60s, 70s into the 80s. And by about the 1990s, medicine recognized that the ethics and law, and particularly ethics, had really changed. The idea of saying that a person does not self-determine their life is simply unethical. Yes, they need the counsel and guidance of the physician, but we should respect the fact that the patient really does need to be given the chance, the opportunity, the right, dare I say, to make the decisions they want to make for their healthcare. So that was one of the first waves in the ethics of medicine, namely the patient decides what the patient's care should be. And then in the late 20th century into the early 21st century, medicine began to recognize we're caring for a lot of patients who are so sick that they can't make decisions. Well, who should make decisions for them? Because we have to have someone make a decision for this person because of this ethic of informed consent. And the stereotype story there was people like Karen Ann Quinlan and other patients with severe brain injury for whom someone had to make very difficult decisions, but no one could clearly figure out who should make those decisions. Well, again, the law stepped in, ethics stepped in, and a whole ethical system was put together, and legal system as well, for the idea of a proxy decision maker, someone who makes decisions on behalf of someone else. And so I remember when I trained, one of the things we always asked a patient was, if you got so sick, you couldn't make a decision about your healthcare, who should we talk to? Who should we seek advice? Who should we talk to? And we did this because we knew people had a variety of different family members, different people they trusted. Sure, in many cases it was, well, talk to my spouse, Why are we having this conversation? Well, okay, fine. You've made me clear to me. I'll talk to your spouse. But not everyone has a spouse, or they have several spouses left over from other relationships, and they're different. Talk to my child. Well, people have lots of children, and they have several children, perhaps, from different epochs of their life. I'm not trying to be flippant, but I'm trying to say, it behooves us to ask someone who should we talk to and not just assume the usual family structures. Well, now enter supported decision making. Our vision for a future of the ethics of medicine is a future where when we make a diagnosis of a disease like Alzheimer's or Lewy body disease or TDP-43, when we say that someone has mild cognitive impairment caused by one of these diseases, we ask them that question. Suppose these memory and thinking problems were getting worse, or as they do develop, who supports you? Who should we talk to? And write that down and designate that individual. And yes, I fully understand how many people would say, well, my wife, she's right here, or my husband or my daughter. I get it, but not everyone comes in with someone else. And the earlier we diagnose these diseases with biomarkers, the more we can label someone before they have any cognitive impairment, or only the most mildest of impairments, the more it behooves us to do this, to find out who will support you, and to make people aware of this very hidden in plain sight fact. There will come a time, if not already has come the time, that you are having challenges making decisions, and someone needs to support you. I'm not trying to take away that role, but I'm trying to bring in those kind of supports for you. I'll wrap up and then we'll switch to questions and answers in just a little bit. There are a few in the chat already in the Q&A. So please put your questions in because we'll make that pivot now to Q&A. But I'll wrap up with this vision for a future, which is as we begin to label brains with biomarkers early in the course of disease, we need to envision a future where adult medicine for individuals who have lived a self-determined, independent life, recognizes really what's the fact for all of us is to one degree or another, we're interdependent. We rely on a variety of technologies, like this thing, okay, the cell phone. We rely on a variety of technologies and people in order for our minds to function at their peak ability. There's something very interesting about the human brain. It's an organ which readily reaches out into the environment using the body to help the brain do what the brain does. The brain is a very clever parasitic-like organ. Whiteboards, chalkboards, paper lists, calculators, iPhones, GPSs. It is interesting how this brain invents a world to help this brain work, as well as other people, relationships. It picks out people that wants to be around, that makes it feel good. and works with them and stays away from those people who are harmful. And so in some sense, all I'm doing with supported decision-making is just helping the brain do what the brain wants, which is to maximize its ability to function in the world. And so it shouldn't be viewed as an assault upon the independence of an individual. It should be viewed as a way to enhance and help that individual flourish. So those were my remarks. There is, by the way, some sort of demonstration unfolding on the campus. I'm hearing it. I hope you're not. Oh, well, you might be hearing it. So let me take a look at the questions. So yes, Pennsylvania law does recognize the role for supported decision making. Under the reforms that have occurred in guardianship, the court is required to seek out the least restrictive alternatives. And implicitly within that, therefore, is supported decision making. You don't need a legal agreement for supported decision making, although depending on the circumstances, it may help. It is a work in progress. And some states have moved farther along. For example, California and Texas are two examples, with legally recognizing the role of supported decision-making more explicitly in their laws around adult protective services and guardianship. There's debate in the legal field as to whether or not it should be viewed of and required to be a legal document. I'm of the view that if someone feels they need it as a legal document, fine, but I would hopeful that it could be a document that ultimately would be recognized as a medical record document. So for example, if I ask you, the person that asked that question, let me just get your name here so I can just make it vivid.
Oh, it was Arthur. Sorry, I might have moved him.
Oh, okay. If I asked him, who should make decisions for you if you can't, and I wrote in the medical record, she designates Julia Sadowski, her sister, and then 2 days later, we need to get a proxy. I say, look, I have in the medical record that she said Julia Sadowski, and that's a legal document. So my hope would be that we could arrive at that for the practice of this in healthcare. So that's the answer to that. Pennsylvania is leading, has a big, the Elder Justice Initiative, which is working in this area. Julie Carson, I hope you enjoyed your doctor's appointment. If I become housebound and have daily care, who monitors the helper to make sure they do what I prefer, feed me when I want to see me? That's a very good question. And I think Joanne Cooper's question raises the importance of having a network of supporters, not just one, but several people who watch over and make it explicit that there's this network that is watching over and looking after someone. One of the problems with guardianships is once you have that guardian, they really rule. And, other than someone calling them out for fraud and abuse, they can pretty much do what they want. And so there's a need to really create that network. How does one learn how to be effective and respectful when providing support to someone else's decision-making? Julia Stewart has just mapped out a line of research, et cetera, that is keeping my colleagues and I busy. I don't mean to be flippant or jocular with my remark, but I just simply want to emphasize that's a fabulous question, Julie. And it brings home the point. This isn't just, oh yeah, support them in making decisions. Oh great, I'll support them. And support decision making has a kind of virtue ethics sound to it. I mean, you just hear it, it must be good. But once you start to think about how you do it, it's not so straightforward. I'll give you some basic points that we've been sort of reflecting on. You need to understand what are the cognitive abilities and disabilities that the person has. Is it memory? Is it executive function? Is it language? And based on what those impairments are, how should you step in and help the individual? What kind of support should you provide? I think it requires skills in what any good professional who works with other individuals develops if they become a good professional. Namely, how do you empathically listen? How do you engage in turn taking? How do you take advantage of time to allow things to settle, et cetera? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of caregivers describe their work, and ultimately what they're describing is the work of like a lawyer crossed with a therapist, gathering information, pondering it, feeding it back, et cetera. And so I think that's the sort of skills people develop or that they don't develop in this caregiving role. And we're working on a project, Emily Largent, my colleague here at Penn, who's in the School of Medicine with me in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy. She leads a grant where the focus of that grant is to figure out how to develop those, what are those skills, and how to create training materials for supporters to work with physicians and patients. I'll second you, Sally Baldus. Yep, normal pressure hydrocephalus isn't common, but it's out there, and if it's not thought of in a differential for someone who has cognitive problems, you're right, it'll be missed. So anonymous attendee asks, how do you balance between protecting the autonomy and rights of individuals with cognitive impairments and ensuring their safety and well-being through guardianship? And it's this talk. I mean, it is this idea of supported decision making and the ideas that emanate from that. I think the more one creates an interdependent, trusted relationship with someone who's reliable, available, and trustworthy, the more you create a milieu, a process that effectively achieves the negotiation between self-determination and protection. And so in some sense, I think this sort of tension that's often portrayed between them can be resolved, if you will, through creating a relationship with an individual who's available, trustworthy, and reliable. Kathy Barton asks if it's hard to change the supportive decision maker if needed. And, we don't have a lot of information about that. Again, meaning that's kind of an empirical question, like as this gets going in practice, in some sense you say, well, how is it that you might transition from one caregiver to the other? And so that's a very good question. And one can imagine, a caregiver that's good in just one stage of the problems might not be good for the later stages of those problems. So anonymous attendee asks, you discussed the changes and complexities surrounding issues like guardianship and decision-making for individuals with cognitive impairments. What are your hopes for the future in terms of improving the lives of these individuals and their caregivers? Well, I'd like to see a system, a society that's set up that recognizes this. So it's not just about medicine. It's about a host of other professions, the law, the financial services industry, government, recognizing the reality that individuals who have cognitive impairments are interdependent with other individuals and need to be incorporated into the way they're, I was going to say cared for, because that's what a doctor does, and I'm a doctor, but the way that they're treated, interacted with, transacted with. I don't know what the terminologies would be for the other professions. I'd like to see that more recognized as part of just the way we live now, not viewed as a sign of weakness, but also and not viewed as a problem, but viewed as just what the norm is. In some sense, this upends the ideal of what it means to be, an adult going to see the doctor. You go on your own, you get your own care. I have no problem with that, but it does recognize the need for this interdependent practice. My relative has designated her husband as supportive decision maker, but a recent visit made clear that the husband is now showing early signs. What path should be appropriate for other family members? Well, that path is just that, which is to begin to get a workup and care for that individual and to recognize just this issue, which there may need to be a transition and who's in the role of supporting the individual. These things can't unfold all at once overnight. But yeah, I mean, that's the supporter themselves now may need themselves a supporter and may not be in that role anymore. How do you handle decision making for someone who's resistant to the idea? Resistant with respect to what and for what reason? Begins to let you sort of think through what the challenge is, what the problem is. I will say, I think in the lives of individuals with cognitive impairment, oftentimes we sort of want them to, quote, agree to everything and understand everything and whatnot. And I think one just has to be careful in negotiating just how much of what needs to be understood and known and figured out. I'm giving you sort of a vague answer. It's interesting. I'll offer you, if I ask my typical patient who I see at the Memory Center, are you having any troubles with your daily life? And so, no. I kind of, so, well, trouble, say, taking care of the finances. No. In other words, they'll give you answers that suggest that they don't, quote, recognize anything is wrong. And what I find, if I used to then just stop there and say, see, they don't see anything's wrong. But what I found was when I started to probe and say, well, what's it like to be Jason, with a cognitive problem? Many of them would say, oh, it's good. I struggle sometimes. So I'm so glad that I have. And then they would name their caregiver. And it's like, I don't know what I'd do without, John or Bill or Susan or whatever. And my point is that they would actually recognize that there's this other individual who is helping me. And without them, I wouldn't be doing fine. And if you think about it, it's in some sense no different than, I wear contacts. And if you said to me, how are you getting around? I'd say, oh, fine. And you seeing things okay? I'm like, yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have my contacts. I'm pretty much I'm a hyper myope. I'd be pretty much kind of struggling to get across a room until whatever. So, and I think that's the case for many individuals who have some sort of disability that's being reasonably accommodated. They're not going to tell you, not because they're in denial, but just I am doing fine. But if you probe and whatnot, they'll say, oh yeah, well, without my rolling walker, I wouldn't be able to get out, and so on. And so I do think that this is a bit of a long answer, but I think this idea that people are, quote, resistant to help is certainly exists. And I have some patients who flat out just simply will not take help and are resistant to it. But I do think there's a nuance in between the resistance and the full acceptance of individuals who, when it's provided, take it, but are always going to be somewhat sort of accommodating to it. What role do I see as technology in shaping the future of care and support for those with cognitive impairment? Well, you kind of saw my little hint there when I waved my iPhone in front of the camera, because I think it's a good example of a technology which has allowed many of us to live well. I can speak personally. Several months ago, for whatever odd reason, my cell phone decided that it wasn't going to accept my password, etc. And it locked me out. And I had to ultimately go to the Apple store to get the thing unlocked. And I was about ready to leave for a trip I had to take. And I realized how utterly dependent I was on that phone to get my ride share app, for my tickets for the plane, and I could just run the long list. And, I think my brain works okay, but I've allowed my brain to use that iPhone a lot. My point is that I think that technology, to the extent that it is an extension of our mind, has tremendous power for our care. I look forward to the day for the self-driving car to become normative. I look forward to the day when all you have to do is queue up the car to come take you where you want to go, and it just takes you there, and there's no one in the front seat propelling you along. I'm not objecting to Uber and whatnot, but to me, that's the next level to go here. That's just one example of the role of technology to make our lives more livable and support us. Hang on, I gotta get the questions here. So what resources exist for caregivers who want to improve the ability to provide supported decision making? Not a lot, and I don't mean to be critical, but the existing materials for caregiver training to make them, how to be a, quote, good caregiver, provide services and supports. As I look at them, I see bits of it in there, how to effectively communicate, how to, relay information. It's not packaged under this idea of how to help the other person make a decision. And I think one of the ways we want to go, one of the future work that my lab wants to work on is to package and develop materials to provide people just that kind of training and support. So a more general question here is about whether there are areas of research or breakthroughs that I'm optimistic about, and how you think they might impact the lives of those affected by cognitive impairment. And, I will say that I think one of the areas of breakthrough that is really impressive right now that's occurred is notable progress in the ability to diagnose these diseases that cause cognitive impairment at the level of what is the disease that's causing it. So when I attend our weekly consensus conference at the Memory Center every Monday morning, it's interesting as I think back to when I first started doing that conference back in 1999, 1998, the differences between then and now. There are many things that are the same. The history that we gather, the neurological exam that we perform, the cognitive testing that we perform. It's pretty much the same as what we did then, and it's extremely helpful. But it is fascinating to see how now we're using technologies like MRI, PET scans, to better distinguish what is the disease that is causing this person to have these cognitive impairments. We are able now, using scans, to determine whether or not the individual actually has Alzheimer's disease in their brain. We're able to better understand whether or not they have Lewy body disease, or TDP-43. It's really spectacular, the progress that we've made. What's also spectacular is the progress in developing treatments. We have the ability now, soon, in fact, mid-November, we're scheduled to give the first infusion of lecanemab, a drug that targets amyloid in the brain of an individual with Alzheimer's disease and the mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia stages, which has been shown to slow the progression of the disease. It's not a cure, it doesn't halt the disease, it doesn't reverse it, but it slows the progression. And for some patients, that's a very desired benefit. I can completely understand that. So we now have the ability to actually slow the progress of the disease. There's another drug soon to probably be approved next month by FDA if all the data hold up. And there are others in the works. And so we're entering an era now where I can tell someone, some people, the cause of their disease to the level of great diagnostic specificity. And for some individuals, the ability to provide a treatment that will slow the progress of that disease, of course, if they want the treatment. So that's great progress. And I think when you take that progress and couple it with the progress we've made in law and ethics, which I've spent the majority of my time talking to you about, I think we should be cautiously optimistic that we can live in a better world than the world that we're living in now, and have been living in, where diagnosis was elusive and care was elusive, and people just sort of figured it out on their own. We have some great challenges, though. There's a paucity of practitioners in this space. We have a long wait list for new patient visits. We have a long wait list to be able to provide lecanemab. We don't see that changing rapidly because we just simply don't have all the resources we need. I'm thrilled to see the investment that's being made in our field now, and I'm confident over time it will get better, but we face some real challenges acutely. I will be candid about that. So let me just see if there are any. I answered Arthur Kaplan's. We're working on that, so that's what we're doing. Thought-provoking insights you've uncovered during your research. Well, what I've talked to you about today was one of them, to be honest. Any strategies or resources help caregivers cope with the pressures of providing care to their loved one and maintain their own well-being? That's a great question. We have a whole, at the Memory Center, we have a cadre of social workers led by Allison Lynn and Felicia Greenfield, who provide caregiver services and supports, training, education, and ongoing support to be able to learn what it is like to be a caregiver and how to provide care. There are certainly a host of decent and well-done books as well, like the 36-Hour Day, for example. But I think the bottom line is, when one enters into the role of being a caregiver, it's a role, and one needs to learn how to do it and how to do it well. It's not just something you can just pick up and do by figure it out as you go. I mean, you can, usually it doesn't work out that well. And finally, of course, to get the kind of support a caregiver needs, it's a time-intensive and cognitively intensive work. I know personally, because I'm in that role myself. And other people don't know what it's like until they're in it, I will freely admit. So the ability to talk to someone about what it's like to be a caregiver, I find to be incredibly helpful. Someone who can listen empathetically. Well, I've enjoyed this opportunity to speak to you. As I say, if you want to learn more about me and who I am, you can go to my website. It's here, I'll put it in the chat. I'm putting it in the chat.
Thank you.
It's just jasonkarlawish.com. You can learn more about me and my writing. If you want to learn more about the Penn Memory Center, I'll put that in the chat. I hope I got that right. Penn Memory Center. Yep, all right. So that's more about me, and that's more about the Penn Memory Center. If you get a chance to take a look at my book and you have any thoughts or comments, drop me a little note. I always like to hear from readers. If the mood possesses you, throw a review up on one of those review sites, because people actually look at those. And again, here's the book. Have a look. It has a whole chapter on the early history of capacity assessment and the problem of guardianship, but that's just one chapter. So I will move on now. I've got to get to my lab meeting. So like I said, I'm in the library now because they shut our offices down because of some of the structural problems. But it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you
Let me
so
turn it
much
back
for
to the
making the
host.
time. Thank you so much. And everyone, we look forward to seeing you for our next event, and have a great day. Thank you.